Mr. Greg Coleridge has been involved with the AMI for quite a number of years, and he first came and gave a brilliant presentation a few years ago, and he's given excellent presentations every time he's come since, which is, I think he's come every time since then. So Greg was also instrumental in getting the Northeast Friends Service Committee to endorse the NEED Act, which is one of the three big endorsements we got. So please give a warm welcome for Mr. Greg Coleridge. Thank you.
To the Power Elite's 8 strategies opposing to monetary reform, but when I knew I had 15 more minutes to work with, I added a couple of extra. But it turns out, of course, I only have a half hour, so I'm just going to have to run through things a bit quicker. Well, thanks so much for being here. Thank you to Jamie and to Stephen for the opportunity to present every year. And thanks to all of you for being here. I always learn so much, and it proves yet again and affirms yet again one of my philosophies in which I always think it's important to be the dumbest person in the room, because that way you learn a lot, and that certainly has been true again for me this year. So, the Power Elite's 10 strategies now opposing monetary reform. To create change, whatever it is on whatever issue we may be connected with and campaign or movement we're connected with, whatever it is that we're concerned about changing, we must develop 2 different sort of approaches. The one is to develop a policy plan, right? That is whatever it is, the laws, legislation, rules, regulations, platform, whatever you want to call it, that we want to see become reality. But the second part is equally important, which is we need to develop a strategic plan. It's not enough just to feel and think that if we come up with the perfect plan, that somehow in the ethos it's going to automatically happen. It doesn't quite work that way. So what is our strategic plan? The way that we're going to bring all of this to life. That's equally important in how we proceed and work as change agents. Well, there's many components or elements to developing a strategic plan. Something called a power analysis of trying to figure out what you're up against, and an important exercise in doing that is, I'm sure many of you have done this in one way, shape, or form in your respective activist circles, it's to develop a SWOT analysis. SWOT standing for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And it's that threats part that in particular I want to, since I've only got 25 more minutes to babble at you, a few things. Well, of course, the threats to real monetary reform are from individuals, organizations, and conditions that are the barriers to change, the blockages. When it comes to individuals and organizations, it is or are they not, who currently benefit from things as they are, right? I mean, heck, you don't need to be a PhD in sort of sociology to kind of figure that out. If the current system is working for them, then why in heaven's name would they want to change it? Concerning monetary issues, it's those financial institutions and or leaders and those who do their bidding who are going to struggle and fight whatever significant change we may be trying to promote. Those in politics, in academics, in media, and those who are connected to nonprofits, who are at the apex, who get funding, who get access, who are change opinion makers and the like. A number of people have attempted to try to develop some scheme for how this thing called the Power Elite works, right? There have been, in the past, C. Wright Mills, who wrote the book, Power Elite. Paul Kivels, You Call This a Democracy, a real good book. William Domhoff, what's his book called? Something about power analysis or democracy, something along those lines. All of those, mostly sociologists, have worked at trying to understand the Power Elite. Now, Occupy helped us along in developing a common cultural meme by labeling, right, this notion of the 1%. But the 1% is more, I think, an accurate description of sort of the economic elite. But it's not necessarily all those economic, and it's not, in my frame and way of thinking, not even the 1%. It's the 1/10 of 1% of those who really have the resources, who are really doing mostly the buying, renting, leasing, or retaining, take your pick, of public officials. So it's that subset, but it's not just the super duper well-to-do that constitute the power elite. There are those other circles, the corporate community and the policy formation organizations. Those are the think tankers that are funded by the other elements, the economic 1/10 of 1% and the corporate community, whose business it is to try to convince us that right is left, top is down, black is white, and all the rest, right? And that we can't do anything because we're too weak, or we just need to leave it into the hands of the people at the top to do things for us. And all we're supposed to do is be in the stands and sort of cheer them on or boo them, right? We're not activists, we're just sort of spectators. But the power elite is that which comes together, the three circles and that space that connects them all. So let's get into the 10 strategies opposing monetary reform. Well, the first is, of course, ignore. When you are ignored, you are, of course, denied that you even exist. And as Oscar Wilde says, there is only one thing in life worse than being talked about, and that's not being talked about. But facts are facts even if ignored, and there's a danger. If the power elite does ignore for too long, then you can become, as Robert Herrick says, a potential spark, neglected, that makes a mighty fire. And that's hopefully what we're trying to do, right? Create a spark, plant a seed, pick your metaphor, that hopefully by the time we're no longer ignored, then we're already in movement business. When it comes to monetary reform examples, well, there are many instances, is there not, where we have been, for real monetary reform anyway, ignored. Media, academics, a variety of the politicians, for the most part, have ignored us. Well, when you can no longer be ignored, then the power elite defends. And they defend themselves and the status quo in a variety of ways that sort of are summarized in a number of D words. The first being to demean, which is, of course, to criticize, laugh at, minimize, smear. You're no longer ignored, right? You have now hit their radar. You now constitute some kind of threat, to whatever extent you are, and you have been forced to be noticed. Along these lines, monetary reform examples, well, right, the smears and the minimizations and being laughed at is to be called everything from gold buggers to conspiratorialists. You're unqualified, you're anti-Semitic, you're part of this cabal that's linked right in with the crazy preppers, radicals. My God, you're linking yourself up with Dennis Kucinich and John Conyers, the most radical people in Congress. All of that are examples of being in one way, shape, or form demeaned. Distort is another example of a strategy opposing. And, this applies, of course, not just to monetary reform, across the board, many of the issues that the power elite doesn't like and is going to do their darnest to oppose. To distort is to misrepresent, claim something different than what you believe or promote. Examples here is, well, to only say that what real monetary reform is about is only concerned about printing money out of thin air. Or to say that, this is inevitably going to cause hyperinflation when you do that. However, it's like anything. It creates an opportunity. Even if you're being, for the most part, shut out of the corporate media and the like, you have an opportunity when things are distorted, maybe, possibly, conceivably, to appeal to the power elite, to the organs of them, the media, to say, hey, this is a distortion. Can't you give me 50 words, 20 seconds, whatever, to correct the distortion? So an opportunity therein lies potentially. 4, to distract, another D word. A popular strategy. Here, distraction is to focus on the unimportant, minor, frivolous, the tangential, that may or may not be related to the issue at hand. Of course, no matter what serious issue, and this applies to 4, 5, dozens, scores, hundreds of issues, does it not? that the real issues are distorted by the mainstream culture via entertainment, which takes the form of all sorts of things, to, of course, our consumer culture, which is becoming less a potential vehicle for distortion as more people are laid off, as there's less money to acquire all of the stuff that has served as one type of a distraction. In terms of monetary reform examples, well, and the Fed, helicopter money, it's focusing on, bank reform versus monetary reform. And sometimes it should be said there's a fine line, right, between some of these things. What is a distraction sometimes can be a distortion and vice versa. Okay, moving from some D words to some C words. The first one being to coerce. Power elite, of course, has quite a number of resources at their disposal to do such coercion. And they certainly take full advantage of their leverage to try to keep people about the business of being quiet and meek and the like. So they can use what leverage they have, funding leverage, to cut funding. So if you're part of a group that gets your money from a big sort of corporate-related foundation, well, guess what? That funding can be cut. You can be, all of a sudden, if your power comes at least in part from access, that access can be denied. Pressure employers. There's sort of a secondary. You may not be directly employed by a power elite, but those interests can go to your employer. Whether it's a media corporation, man, you're actually doing an expose in whatever is going on. Well, there's many examples in many instances where that has occurred. Colleges, universities make sure, and this can be certainly at the end side or even at the beginning side, that they can use their leverage to threaten. And so if that threatened pressure on employers at the front end, and that is done by the heads of economics departments or whatever, then clearly that message can be conveyed to prospective employees, professors, who are maybe thinking about doing research. Well, that can be a kibosh can be put on that right away. So there's a number of examples in terms of monetary reform. Of course, pressure on professors from the Federal Reserve or bank. You're not going to be appointed to some cushy committee, or media companies because they have debt. Who owns the debt? Well, banking corporations do. Also, media corporations get ads from banking corporations. Number 6. Now we move into two of my very favorite. And I guess these are my very favorite because these have been particularly effective over time, millennia, on many an issue. And that is, number 1, co-opt, is to cherry pick, is to figure out ways to make you ineffective by co-opting a variety of different things. They can try to co-opt the message or the frame. You have been effective at defining really what we really mean by real monetary reform as being equated to sovereign money, democratic money, whatever. All of a sudden they co-opt it. They take that message, they take that label, they take that frame and define it in ways that they want to do so. So reform oftentimes becomes deform. There was welfare reform. There's all kinds of reform, right? Is it reform or really not? Or they can co-opt the actual plan. The AMI and the NEAT Act claims there are these 3 interconnected elements. So the powers to be can cherry pick and say, oh, we're only going to focus on one of these, like what in England did with the Bank of England. We'll just allow the Bank of England to serve as sort of a publicly owned central bank, but we're not going to touch fractional reserve lending or a variety of other elements. So co-opt it. Co-opt the plan. Or you co-opt leaders or thinkers via a variety of ways. We'll give you a job, right? That revolving door that Howard talked about, that they're in the regulatory agency, they're in government trying to maybe do good, trying to promote the 100% plan, but with the potential of promotion of a job or money, access, status, they may end up being promoting only the 50% of the plan, or they move from the public sector to the private sector. A variety of different ways through inducements to get people to do the right thing by co-opting leaders or thinkers. Another is conquer, as in divide and conquer. Right? It's the deliberate effort to split groups or individuals over real or artificial issues, of course, personalities and turf. My God, again, from time memorial, never mind the power elite doing it. We tend to do a pretty spectacular job of dividing ourselves without very much help at all from the power elite. But when necessary, the power elite certainly will play on those divisions that may not be all that serious and really work it, really try to divide it, really try to push it. Now, I have the question mark next to monetary reform examples because I'm not quite sure. And it's not to say that these 10 strategies are presented in any kind of sequential way. They're not necessary. But this one does represent something where you've got to be pretty far along in the threatening the status quo place before the powers to be use things like co-optation and dividing and conquer. And quite honestly, we're not there yet. So they haven't had to do that. So what kind of dividing and conquering is going on? And sometimes there's very good reasons why we want to be divided and groups want to be separate from other groups because they're not on the same page, philosophically or strategically. Absolutely, positively. It is Pollyannic to think that somehow on any of these issues we are automatically going to have every single actor under a single umbrella that is focusing on a single strategy, a single set of tactics, and have agreed to a single mission statement or plan. It ain't going to happen. It ain't going to happen. But we can certainly try to make that tent as large as possible and not, as one of my favorite sayings is, you compromise on the non-essentials, but not on the essentials. Now, what those are, of course, is a matter of opinion and difference of opinion. But anyway, just as an operating principle. Number 8 is you flat out outlaw. You make illegal that which is a proposed reform, a change, alternative. Now, there aren't particular examples right now of monetary reform where you just make some things illegal, but there are some examples out there related to economic or financial examples, right? When the economy was doing horrifically during the Depression, FDR outlawed the holding of gold as a form of escape, form of wealth. You abolish cash, which is being talked about now, as a way to try to maybe lay the groundwork for implementing negative interest rates. And when it comes to labor, of course, labor, through the Taft-Hartley Act, outlawed secondary boycotts. So you don't directly boycott, you boycott entities or people who are suppliers of the main entity or company that you're opposed to as a union. That's been outlawed. And just in general, whatever you're outlawed, I should have changed the order of some of this, does it not become more frequently that just doing protesting opposed to any issue that's close to whatever the power elite is, a group of business people or the WTO or the Democratic and Republican conventions, no longer can you be directly in the face of these people. You got to be half a mile away in the next county in some cattle placed with fences around called a protest zone, right? I mean, and they call that First Amendment rights, free speech, right? So you outlaw. Number 9, abuse. And the reality is, not to be sort of melodramatic about this, but the reality is when social movements have become effective, they just flat out, one strategy is to intimidate, if not to repress and eliminate people, is you use violence. Beat up, jail, torture, assassinate. It's happened before. If there is a serious threat to the status quo, and there's a lot of these elements right now that are teetering, whether it's our political system, economic, environmental, social, racial, there are multiple crises going on. Who knows which one of those is going to provide that spark, that trigger, that 100th monkey phenomena, as Ken Keyes called it, whatever, the tipping point variety, that will bring along sort of a crisis that will, I think, cause some panic or some de-evolution of many of these things. If one of these sectors sort of has problems, I think there will be problems with many others that will be magnified. And if that happens, This is inevitable in some way, shape, or form, no matter whether we use in response violence or nonviolence. And finally, neglect. Now, how can anything be worse than sort of physical abuse? Well, by neglect, we mean that if and when serious problems do explode, implode, whatever you want to call it, and reforms are successful, the last line of defense of the power elite is refusal to outright or to inadequately implement, monitor, or fund programs. And there are examples. There aren't necessarily monetary reform examples because we haven't achieved anything yet. But in terms of financial examples and other examples, and a lot of what I do has been involved in issues around corporate constitutional rights and money as speech. And a classic example here is state of Massachusetts a number of years ago passed at the state level voluntary full public financing of elections. Powers to be, politicians, corporate crowd didn't want it. They couldn't stop it because the public did an end run, right, via ballot initiative. Got on the ballot, it won. Powers to be said, fine, we're just not going to fund it. So what good is a system of where the state is providing a limited amount of funds to candidates who forswear accepting any amount of funding from anyone, including their grandmothers, if there's no money in the kitty to do it? That's how you kill it. So these represent our 10 strategies. However, how do we counter them? Well, you've got to develop, this goes back to the other part of this. You have to develop, right? We have to develop a strategic plan to create and maintain power. We must be just as committed and invest just about as much time, if not maybe more, to develop this strategic organizing plan as we do or have in developing our program plan. There's 3 elements. I mean, there's sort of a lot more. This is how I boil it down. To do the kind of change we're talking about is a little different than the kind of change that I guess a person who came here a number of years ago, Ed Chambers, wasn't he one of the speakers here with the Industrial Areas Foundation a number of years ago? Very successful group that's done tremendous organizing at a grassroots level, sort of in the model of Saul Alinsky. He was sort of a follower, and Alinsky was one of his mentors. And he carried on the tradition of Alinsky and formed this very powerful kind of organizational model that organizes at the grassroots level, mostly through communities of faith, churches. But most of what they try to do is sort of reform it. It's doable. It's what can be won like within the next year or two. This is not the kind of organizing we need. We need not transactional organizing, which is sort of the model of the IAF. We need transformative type of organizing model. And that kind is best reflective in trying to build a mass movement. A second element is to develop the structure. So you've got to plan strategically, externally, how the heck are you going to try to bring this to life programmatically, but you also need to plan internally. What are the structures? What are the institutions that are necessary? How are we going to fund them? How are we going to staff them? Who are we going to work with? Of course, all of these are interrelated, interconnected, but it's sort of a separate category just for the purposes of mentally trying to separate this thing so that we're not paralyzed when we're trying to do this. And third, while it's not essential, it helps a whole lot. If along the way your movement is also developing some real life, on the ground, micro alternatives that you're working on strategically when you have made a demand to the power elite, and as a way to try to combat you, they sit on it. Because there's no better way to kill a movement than when you have developed all kinds of energy, you presented a demand, and then they try to kill you through inaction. That's when focusing on something that you're able to do in an arena that you can control is so important. It's why Gandhi was so involved in sort of the effort at developing ashrams and developing his own clothing and the like. It's why the Black Power movement, like in the 60s, had schools and food centers and feeding programs and the like. It's why the populists in the 1870s and 1890s developed co-ops. They had this external program to go after the bankers, but they had an internal program of developing sort of a union of poor, stupid farmers that supposedly didn't know what the hell they were doing and talking about. It's not necessary, but it sure does help. All right, just focusing and almost at times. The goal here of building a mass movement, of course, is to develop mass public support. I mean, we've got to develop a plan that ultimately gets people who numerically are in the majority. No question about it. We got to get at least 51%. But that's not enough, as hard as that may be. A subset of that has got to be active support. And by active support, those are people who are willing to really go to the turf for you. Now, research that's been done on this really says, okay, while you need 51% who are in the stands, who are cheering you on, you've got to have 3.5% of the population that's on the field, that's in the game, that's willing to mix it up. Now, that's, it's not 51% that have to be actively engaged. That's good. But 3.5% is still 11 million people, based on the population. That's a lot, but is it a lot? Don't know. And how do we do it? Well, there's all sorts of tactics that come into play. The idea is to build a civil resistance campaign that involves education, protest and persuasion, boycotts, resistance, which is nonviolent civil disobedience, disruption, escalate. I mean, the civil rights movement really represents such a wonderful example and illustration of how they develop campaigns, connecting and thinking about how these things operated, these tactics, not sort of at a horizontal level, because you never want to do 5 things that are horizontally operating, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You want to do 5 things like a staircase that's building on the previous one, right? So that the 5th step, you are much further up where you want to be. The requirements for doing all of this are, you got to be committed. Everybody wants to be, do they not, in doing the work, doing the program work, or even being behind the scenes doing the administrative work, right? Nobody, I hate program planning. God, I hate it. But you got to do it. We got to do it, I believe. We've got to do it. Do corporations do strategic planning? Does the military do strategic planning? Do politicians, the Democrats and Republicans at the upper level, do strategic planning? Yeah, they all do it. But somehow we think we can operate off the seat of our pants or just out of some movement thing, or believing that some spark out there will create some automatic thing that we can ride some wave. We can use those sparks. You never know when those are going to happen. And you have to sort of build some flexibility in the plan, because nothing can be so static that you are not going to respond to the Occupy movements out there and to civil rights movements out there and the like. But you got to be committed. You got to be disciplined. And here, sort of counterintuitively here, even though we have to be committed to nonviolence, what does discipline mean here? It means being so disciplined that we share, I think, maybe more so on this point with the military than we do with some of our friends in sort of the activist community that just feel we can operate on the seat of our pants and do these random acts of education, organizing that really don't add up. They don't add up to being greater than the sum of its parts. And that's what we need to be. And sacrifice. And the sacrificing part is, yes, time, energy, treasure, but it may also be physically, literally sticking our necks on the line at some point. All right, almost done. Frederick Douglass laid it out, his philosophy of reform. You may not be able to read it. The whole history of the progress of human liberty shows that if there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one. And it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Or, as Dave Roberts, environmental journalist, if you want to move the center, you better be able to pull from one end. And that's what we want to do, right? Pull from one end. Successful civil resistance movements, there they are. They've all involved having strategic plans, and some have been more successful than others, to be sure. Some are still sort of in operation, and some, even when you win, there's no win that's ever permanent, right? You got to keep at it. But just look, marriage equality, 10 years ago, who would have conceived we would be where we are in the United States? It's just mind-boggling, the advancement. Did this happen because all of a sudden 7 Supreme Court, right? Wasn't it 7-0? Or I don't know. I think it was unanimous. Did those guys and gals all of a sudden have some sort of wake-up call? And even though they're appointed lifers, there's a culture out there. And a big part of building a civil resistance movement isn't so much changing the laws, changing the economic rules, it's changing the culture. If you change the culture, changing the laws, changing the rules, changing the regulations, even changing the Constitution becomes a whole lot easier. All of these movements focused on trying to develop a civil resistance campaign that focused on changing the culture. Why is it essential? Well, because at some point the system, political, economic, environmental, social, racial, but for our purposes, sort of financial, it's pick your favorite thing. House of cards, whatever it may be. It's unsustainable. And there will be a fundamental crisis. And when that happens, the power elite, who have been saying, just listen to us, follow us, we know what you're doing, we know what we're doing, we'll lose credibility. There will be an opportunity, a justice opportunity, an economic and political. And Joe Bongiovanni, I agree, it's all about political economy. Those are the two spheres, I think, that are inextricably connected. There will be those democratic openings, those justice openings, and we have to be prepared to fill that vacuum, to fill that void. There are plenty of good ideas out there, but unless we're in position, we being those who feel that we've got the real monetary reform plan, we're in a position to control the levers of power, our plan simply won't be implemented. Rather, the power elite will, even if they're weakened, they'll try to go and use what they can, coerce, co-opt, etc. Or the power elite will partially or totally collapse. Even if they stay powerful, they'll try to use their efforts, their strategies. But even if they're overthrown or even partially weakened, there's no guarantee that if there is a mass civil resistance movement that comes in and fills the bill, then it'll be us. It may be a movement that has adopted a monetary reform plan that's only 50% of what we want, or 25%, or 10%. Or they've so co-opted it that it says monetary reform, but it's hardly anything. So we got to make sure that both the plan and the movement is our plan and our movement. Either way, real monetary reforms will be, no pun intended, trumped. So let us not only continue to work on strengthening our monetary policy plan, but on our strategic organizing plan. Thanks. And I know we're out of time, but just 2 shameless self-promotions. One is in the back on the table. The American Friends Service Committee has worked with a number of different groups. I've certainly borrowed, stolen, and the like from Steve Zarlinga and the work of the AMI to develop this monetary history calendar that comes out once a week. Sent to your email inboxes. If you're interested, pick up one, and there's an email address on how to subscribe. And the other is there's something called a democracy history calendar that we started beginning of January 1st that focuses on elements and little anecdotes and historical facts of people, events, occurrences, laws, and the like that focus on oppression, self-determination, self-governance, and the like. All right, I guess we're out of time.
We'll take 1 or 2 questions.
Yeah. Oh, all right.
Yes. Greg, thank you for
Oh.
your presentation. There's an 11th strategy that I've encountered, and I wondered if you would respond. Thank you so much for the presentation. So one of these strategies that I've often received is to cast doubt, to say, well, there's no real actual precedent for this kind of public money system that you are suggesting, proposing? You know, you can't really point to
Yep.
government or society that's actually done it to deliver these kind of results. It seems more like a theoretical model, all these mathematics, etc. So I often find this sort of doubt, sort of casting doubt, and putting it back on me because I can't point to 3 countries that have done it. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on
No, that's very good.
that?
Yeah, I mean, I like it. It's sort of related to demean, but it is separate enough. Plus, it's a D word, so that would fit into my thing. So that's good. But also, I think it's very important, particularly these days, where that has been brought up, not so much in, certainly in monetary circles, but what strikes me, the moment you raised it, was climate change, right? Oh my God, there's only 97% of climate scientists who believe there's a relationship between climate and human cause of it. So they tried to cast doubt because there's a difference of opinion. Well, yeah, there's 3%ers who feel otherwise. So that can be a definite strategy to immobilize, to temporarily get people off of the track of moving. Absolutely. Good one. And I'm sure there are others. So thank you for that. How do we counter it? Well, I think you counter it by, to the extent of where things have been brought up, where things have been tried, even if they're at the micro level, in the present or in the past. They're not full plans, but they're partial, and they've shown that even when you've had U.S. money, ragtag group of revolutionaries, here's, Civil War greenbacks, a variety of things they've been able. So a variety of different ways, and I'm sure there are others that, because I'm looking at the clock, aren't immediately coming to me. But a very good one. Thanks for that.
Thanks. I've been thinking that probably a political campaign is kind of a example of something where you have to do strategic planning, and that's fundraising, that's making big coalitions, for instance, like with, for instance, those who build infrastructure, the Road Builders Association, or the Teaching Association, and maybe the medical community, and building coalitions with them and trying to raise the status of the issue until we can make a political, killing, so to speak, if you know what I mean. But yeah, it has to be a strategic plan, and I'd say that one of the easiest ones is the plan for running a political campaign.
Well, a political campaign, the political or electoral, if that's what you mean. I mean, part of what building a mass movement is in a sense being political, versus electoral, which is trying to elect or unelect people. And I don't think these things are mutually exclusive. I mean, the populists had an electoral arm of what they did. The Greens feel it's very important. They're working on the outside and the inside, if you will, together. I think it's very important in what AMI has done in trying to reach out and identify friends. And I think it's been incredibly important to have had an actual workable plan be introduced. Even if we knew from the start that it had 0 chance of being passed. Well, why in the world would you want to do that? Because what it is, it's a flagpole. It's an anchor. It's something real and tangible that has been introduced. And let's face it, in our society, right? We tend to, it's an actual bill. It's not just some, mischief maker Coleridge out there talking about it, or whomever. It's something that's really been introduced. A couple of people have sponsored it, others have co-sponsored it. It's now there, and it can be used as an anchor, and it legitimizes then what we do in the grassroots. And the stronger we
endorsed it.
And right.
Thank you very much, Greg.
Right, and other people endorse it,
Yes.
And so it serves as a vehicle for doing that very thing.
Now, while we just get Jim Wirt up here, Stephen has a question as well. Thank you.
Yes, Greg. I think given an excellent theoretical presentation of various factors that one runs into. Have you considered, and I have run into all of them, basically in one form or another, even before the book became published, we began to run into a number of these factors. Have you considered particularizing those theoretical concepts that you put up there, as in such and such, for example, what is done by XYZ? Is this something that you're avoiding, or could you see the possibility of how particularizing these excellent general concepts might enable the average person in this room to identify some of the problems?
Well, yeah, I mean, on some of these things I did give some general examples, but for space limitations, time considerations, yeah. But that can certainly be filled out in written form versus a half hour, 45-minute PowerPoint presentation.
For not doing it.
No, there is not. I think, again, the more, and part of this is, right, when you're going into a nonviolent battle, you got to know what you're up against. And so part of doing this is to know what you're up against and to fill in where there are gaps and, you know, where there's an 11th one or 12th one or 13th one. And of course, this is my schema. Others may take these and organize them in different ways. There's no one way to do it. This is certainly not the only way. But as a step to doing a plan is, you know, as the SWOT analysis, you got to know your threats. And all of these represent just that one sort of piece of it. There's the similar kind of breadth and depth that needs to occur in developing what are our strengths, what are our opportunities, right? What are our weaknesses, as well as what are our threats. So, but all of this is the kind of thing that people would do when they would be about the business of seriously grappling with what we're up against and what we need to do.